What would you do? You wake up to the sound of bombs. The walls are shaking. Your children are screaming. You live in Gaza, the most densely populated strip of land on Earth. There's no escape. There's no way out. There's no end in sight. You hear the warnings to leave your homes, to go to the refugee zones. But how, you ask? The roads are rubble. People have been shot for trying to move when they weren't allowed, and you've got little kids, a pregnant wife, an elderly parent. How do you carry them through a war zone? And even if you could, you've heard the stories, the safe zones aren't safe. Families are packed into tents, no clean water, no food, no medicine, and the bombs fall there too. So you stay because what choice do you have? As you sit there in the rubble of what used to be your home, holding your kids close, you remember the stories. Stories from your parents about how they were forced from their homes, about the massacres, about what they lost. You've never seen the places they came from. You're not allowed to. You're trapped here. And still somehow you're the threat. You, a father, a mother, a child. And they say that your dream of freedom, that your very existence is that of terrorism, of hate. You don't want to leave, but you don't want to live like this either. Every time you try to just live your life, you're reminded you're not allowed to. Your life is not your own. Your farmland is taken. The sea is blocked. Your home is a target. Your family, your neighbors, collateral damage. And you've tried everything. Protests, you get shot at. Diplomacy, ignored. Elections, you don't even remember the last time there was an election. Even when you raise your hands in surrender, the bombs fall. And you didn't choose Hamas. You didn't ask for their rule, but they're there, funded by foreign powers, enabled by the very ones who bomb you. And the world sees you as them, but their power isn't yours. But that doesn't matter. You still pay the price. Your children ask, why do they hate us? You don't know what to say. You don't hate them. You've never even met them. You hate what's being done to you, what's being done to your family, but hate? No, you just want to live. And yeah, you know people who do hate. People who say, there's no other choice. We either die fighting or we just die. You don't agree, not really, but you understand them. Because what do you say to someone who's watched their child starve to death or their father be buried beneath rubble? What do you say to someone who's been told that they're a terrorist just because of where they live? What would you do if your whole life was surrounded by walls and drones? And if surrender meant a slow death and resistance meant a quicker one? What would you do when the story of your suffering got edited out of the textbooks? And the ones who dropped the bombs wrote that history and wrote it in a way that justified them. Maybe you'd stay silent. Or maybe you'd go mad. Maybe, just maybe, you would do something unreasonable. And it's not because you're evil. And not even because you're irrational, but because as the world kept repeating its sins, you finally said, no more.
If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I'm your host, Jacob Winograd. If you caught last week's episode, you know we cracked open some heavy stuff. Narrative control, revisionist history, the debate between Dave Smith and Douglas Murray. But I want to go deeper in this episode. And this isn't about defending any one side, not the Palestinians, the Israelis, not Churchill, not Hitler. It's about asking harder questions, more fundamental questions, Like, what makes people snap? What drives a man to do something unthinkable? Not because he's irrational or crazy, but because every door has been shut except one. Whether it's a Palestinian father under occupation, a disillusioned German after World War I, the question is the same. What do you do when you've exhausted every peaceful option? And that's what we're diving into today. Because from Gaza to Nazi Germany to a man in Colorado who modified a bulldozer into a homemade tank, and you have him connecting those dots today, and from Daryl Cooper's Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem to the myth-making of Churchill and Empire, we're going to ask the kind of questions that get you called names on the internet. Not that that's hard. And we've said some of this before, I know, but we're going to talk about, if we're going to talk about blowback and trauma and how power shapes memory and history, we can't just dip our toes in. We need to wade into the uncomfortable. Because explaining evil isn't the same as excusing it, as I discussed last week. And as Christians, we understand that we won't stop all evil, not until Christ returns and his kingdom is fully consummated. But that doesn't mean that we are silent or do nothing in the meantime. We are still called to resist evil, to expose it, to speak truth, and to seek justice, even knowing that it won't always work out cleanly or perfectly on this side of eternity. But if we ever hope to combat it, we need to understand what gives birth to it. So I want to talk about Daryl Cooper. Daryl's a Navy veteran. He's an independent historian and the host of the Martyr podcast, which has become one of the most compelling, long-form storytelling projects on the internet today. His series, Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem, traces the deep and complex history of Zionism, anti-Semitism, trauma, and identity in both Jewish and Western consciousness. And it's a masterpiece beyond just of history, of nuance and empathy. And it's actually the inspiration for how I opened this episode. I had made an X post with everything I read sometime in the last 6 to 8 months, and I modeled it after what Daryl Cooper did in the Martyr podcast, how he opened this series. Now, somewhat recently, Cooper found himself at the center of a media firestorm. This was after appearing on on Tucker Carlson's show, and that moment is so infamous that now it's like routinely brought up as a reference point, including during the recent debate between Dave Smith and Douglas Murray. What sparked the outrage was that he dared to poke at one of the West's most sacred cows, which is the mythology of World War II. He went on Tucker Carlson and he said something that shouldn't have been that controversial, not if like everyone was adults and mature and approaching these things with open minds. If we actually cared about history instead of national bedtime stories or fairy tales, I don't think that it would have been that controversial. But what he did was he questioned the sort of, untouchable, view of not just the West and the Allies, but of Churchill. And this isn't because he's pro-Hitler. It's not because he's a Holocaust denier. These are the things that get thrown around. But this is because he wanted to ask whether the war, in all of its horror, could have been avoided or at least mitigated. Whether the actions of the so-called good guys were always morally justified, and whether the stories we tell ourselves about World War II are actually helping us see clearly, or, just like I talked about last week, just part of the narrative control and helping to make us complicit and happy to go along with, things going on today. He called World War II a load-bearing myth, and I think he's right. And he explains it this way, and I think it's accurate, that myth doesn't even mean that it's a lie, right? Myth just means that it's a sacred narrative. It's a symbolic story reinforced from childhood through movies, textbooks, museums, and the media. And it's a story we're not allowed to question without being accused of heresy, essentially. Because if you challenge the idea that World War II was purely this epic of good versus evil, and that Churchill was part of that and was a heroic bulldog who saved civilization, and that the Allies were only ever acting in righteous defense, then you're accused of justifying Hitler or minimizing the Holocaust. Never mind things like the Bengal famine, which killed millions under Churchill's orders while he cracked jokes about Gandhi. Never mind the firebombing of Dresden and Tokyo, where tens of thousands of civilians were incinerated. Never mind that Churchill refused peace overtures, sometimes even escalating bombing raids in response to German calls for negotiation. Never mind that Hitler, as evil as he was, offered to relocate Jews rather than exterminate them in the early years, and that the US and Britain turned them away, or that mainstream historians like Herbert Hoover begged Churchill to allow food relief into occupied Europe to prevent mass starvation, and he refused. And yet, when Daryl Cooper says these things, and again, quoting from mainstream historians, and all these things being very well historically documented facts, and we can debate over the interpretation of those facts, but these are facts, many of them repeated in books published by Oxford or Yale or the Hoover Institution itself. He was denounced by the White House, the media, and party leaders as if he'd gone full neo-Nazi. Because once you question the myth, even with receipts, then you're the enemy. But as Christians, we don't build our lives on these myths, right? We don't build our lives or our conceptions of truth and morality or our allegiances in the mythos of America or the wars it's fought or anything like that. We build it on Christ, on his kingdom, and the truth. And that means we can't afford to just accept lies, or at least just accept narratives, as I talked about last week, that are just given to us and not be willing to critically examine them. And that can sometimes mean that, we might be putting ourselves into the territory of being called names or being smeared. And that's the price sometimes of being countercultural. And I think I would rather be smeared than be complicit in just accepting narratives and propaganda that lead to war, that justify bombs and starvation and empire. So let's slow down. I just threw a lot out there. Before we even run through the list of the claims and controversies, I want to dig deeper here and ask this very foundational question of why revisit this at all? Like, why this specific era? Because even if you agree with me that, as Christians, we should be critical of narratives that are pushed, why is this one getting so much attention? Why should we take the time to go back and dig through old archives and dust off Churchill quotes and, relitigate stuff that happened 80 years ago? Because this is more important than just a conversation about history. It's a conversation about discernment. It's about learning whether or not it was possible to avoid what ended up being the second worst possible outcome in modern human history. The worst would have been if everything happened and Hitler won, and luckily Hitler did not win. But we essentially got the second worst outcome, which is that Hitler didn't win, but we still had tens of millions of people killed, the world burning, genocides happening anyway. And the victors walk away from this ashes and tell the story that they were the good guys doing everything they could to stop, these evil nations. And I care about relitigating that history because I think that there's holes there, but this is also about like the lessons that people try to draw from that era then get repeated in modern time. Everyone, like every intervention in my lifetime has been, oh, Saddam Hussein is Hitler, right? Vladimir Putin is Hitler. Everyone's Hitler. Even Trump's been Hitler, right? And when it comes to how you deal with terrorists, how you deal with different entities, when like state entities, national entities that are being aggressive or that don't line up with the certain values or beliefs or agendas, then it's to say, well, if you're not going to be tough on them, like if you're not tough on Putin, well, what are you? Are you Chamberlain or are you Churchill, right? Are you going to appease or are you going to be tough? And so this is about history, but it's also about discernment, and it's about what are our priorities as Christians? Like, what are we trying to get out of these conflicts? Are we trying to score points and win and be tough guys, or are we concerned about truth, and are we concerned about avoiding these outcomes that are absolutely devastating? And that's what Cooper is trying to get at too. That's why he asks these hard questions. He's not trying to defend the wicked, but really to expose the possibility, the tragedy, that it didn't have to get to that point, that the war might have been avoidable, that lives might have been saved, and that the West had really sought peace, really exhausted every option to avert war and genocide. Maybe we'd be living in a much different world right now, telling much different stories. So if you want to, I'm not going to be able to completely cover everything, but there's a really good, if you want to dive deeper into this, I highly recommend checking out Daryl Cooper's appearance on the Scott Horton Show. And the specific one that I'm referencing, I'll have linked in the show notes. It's one of the most important interviews for understanding what Daryl is actually saying, and more importantly, why he's saying it. Again, not to excuse evil, not to glorify bad actors, but to understand how real people facing real suffering and real humiliation come to commit atrocities. And that's what Daryl does in all of his work. He did this in Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem. He explores not just what the Zionists did or what the Arabs did, but why they did it. And he's done the same thing again with other topics. Like he has one on Jonestown. I think he's done one on Waco, and he's going to be doing one coming up on World War II. And he's going to do it from the perspective of the Germans, to be like, well, how did the German people view World War II and the lead up and aftermath as they were going through it? And why do you do that? Because it's not realistic to say that the German people were normal, just like average Europeans in 1920, and then like turned into demons by 1935 to 1945, but then magically became normal, decent human beings again after 1945. Like that's just not how human nature works. And if we pretend it is, we'll never recognize the warning signs when they appear again in our own time of evil regimes cropping up or similar mistakes being made. So let's walk through some of the actual claims Cooper made, which I've alluded to. And this isn't even to say that he's necessarily right about everything, because I've done my best to fact check a lot of his claims, and a lot of it comes down to, as far as I can tell, that none of the things that are reported are false, but there's disputes over the extent to which they matter or the interpretation of them. So you'll kind of see what I get into. But even if his interpretations are contestable, or even if he has a couple minor things wrong, that's not even I'm not doing this podcast to defend Daryl Cooper as like the final authority on these things, right? But again, just to understand why he even wants to ask these questions, why I want to ask these questions. And so, let's start out with this question. Did Hitler want war with Britain and France? So that's complicated. He certainly didn't want it at the beginning. He didn't start out by wanting it. He talked about loving the British Empire, saw them as natural allies against Bolshevism, against communism, and he did make efforts to negotiate, especially in before and after invading Poland. Now, hear like, okay, well, it's Hitler, like, him offering peace, him saying he doesn't want to invade. Can you trust that? Well, we have to be careful not to read back into history things that we know now that they didn't know back then, right? And I don't think it's fair to say that back in the lead up to both before Poland's invaded or even after, that we 100% can say that they knew that Hitler was so untrustworthy that no deal was worth possibly trying to make, because he would have just reneged on all of them. So we can't say that peace wasn't possible, and we also cannot say that it wasn't worth at least trying, right? Like, they didn't even entertain it. So I think this means that this is, I guess, like the first, if it's a death by 1,000 cuts, this is the first example of how we don't have a cut and dry battle of good versus evil. Or at least that's the question I'm trying to keep us pointed on. Like, again, was the war and the extent to which it happened completely inevitable? Did Churchill have to escalate when he, could he have de-escalated at points? And there's evidence he escalated when he could have de-escalated. Again, many peace offers and overtures were dismissed out of hand. And, there were bombing campaigns that were launched in 1940, even before the Blitz began. And in that conversation I told you about between Daryl and Scott, the idea of, they talked about how the idea of mass starvation as a weapon of war, that wasn't beneath Churchill. And, that's the Bengal famine, which you can look into, which Churchill mocked. So, I mean, and millions died there, right? So, I mean, I'm not saying intent doesn't matter and that there's not something especially evil about the pernicious hatred of Jews that Hitler had that led to the deaths of millions of Jews. But then to like hold Churchill up as just like this unquestionable good guy when he has millions of deaths on his hand, on his watch for his policies, again, it's just things that are, again, death by 1,000 cuts here. Well, that's a pretty deep gash into the idea that Churchill equals good guy, right? And that was the whole thing that Daryl got in trouble for, was for saying that although he the way Daryl put it was that Churchill didn't commit the most atrocities and perhaps wasn't the most evil, but that in some ways Churchill was a villain in World War II insofar as he contributed towards getting that second worst outcome. And if it hadn't been for certain stances and policies of his, like, the war might have still happened and people might have still died, but it didn't have to get to the degree that it got to. Let's talk about, speaking of like the Holocaust, was that the original plan from the outset, right? Again, something that puts up red flags in people's brains, but that Daryl's claim is, and I think this is historically supported as far as I can tell, is that the final solution is just that. Like, it's the final solution, not necessarily the first solution. It developed over time. And this isn't to say Hitler didn't have at least a desire to do ethnic cleansing, if not genocide of the Jews, and did not, he definitely hated the Jews, right? Daryl says that, in every podcast of his I've ever listened to, he's like, yeah, no, Hitler definitely hated the Jews. He even has one episode where he goes into like, hey, this is kind of like the history of the things that Hitler and other Germans experienced that wrongly, but here's how it happened, led to them looking to the Jews and hating them and using them as a scapegoat for a lot of things. But there were, as I said, I think I said this in the intro, Hitler at many points was saying, well, let's just get the Jews out of here, whether that's sending them to Madagascar or, even saying that he was going to pay the way for Britain and the U.S. to take the Jews. So, and we have to also, when we're talking about the Holocaust, realize that it wasn't until the war turned and the ghettos became unsustainable that the machinery of extermination was really fully unleashed. And then you have things like the British blockade contributing to mass starvation, even among the Jews. And yeah, there was a Nazi policy driving a lot of things in the Holocaust, including some of the starvation. It certainly doesn't help when you have a British blockade that's designed to strangle supplies to the continent. And so, historians debate over how much that contributed directly to the death toll. But Churchill was warned and told by his advisors that the Jews in the camps were starving, and he still chose not to lift the blockade. And this really then leads to, I think, the most damning thing of all. And there's this juxtaposition here that I really want to highlight that I think is just, I think it's hard for me to say it, but I think if I say it well enough, and you might have to go back and like listen to me say it again and really think about it. But I think like once you see it, it's hard to unsee, and I think it's pretty damning. The Allies said they couldn't negotiate with Hitler. He was evil, not trustworthy, and yet they refused the Jewish refugees. And they said, we can't make peace with Hitler. He's evil. He can't be reasoned with. It's like, okay, so then what did you do? If he was so evil that negotiation was impossible, why did you do almost nothing to save the people he was hunting? The U.S. turned away Jewish refugees, even ships like the MS St. Louis, St. Louis, that carried nearly 1,000 desperate Jewish souls, most of whom were later killed in the Holocaust. And Britain locked its doors and blocked Jewish immigration to Britain and also to Palestine. And the West had this whole conference in 1938, the Evian Conference, to address the refugee crisis. And do you know what came of it? Nothing. Country after country stood up and basically said, sorry, we're full. Even once the killing camps were operational, once they knew what was happening, they didn't do anything. Like, they didn't even bomb the rail lines to Auschwitz. And let's be clear, they did know. By 1942, the Western Allies had credible intelligence that the Jews were being systematically murdered in Nazi-occupied Europe. Reports came in from the Polish underground, from Jewish escapees, from eyewitnesses like Jan Karski. By the summer of 1944, there was the Verba Wetzler report that provided a detailed account of the Auschwitz operations, including the layout of the camp, the gas chambers, the crematoria, the mass killings, and the Allies received these reports sometime in 1944. And the American spy planes were flying over southern Poland and were even accidentally photographing Auschwitz while on bombing runs against industrial targets nearby. And, that you can see it in the pictures, the gas chambers and the long lines of prisoners. It's all there in black and white, and yet nothing. The Allies didn't bomb and try to, didn't bomb the camps and try to rescue them. They didn't bomb the rail lines. Instead, they prioritized military targets, and then on their own targeted German civilians, right? And then you had the blockade and all that. It was basically total war, knowing that they were leaving the most vulnerable to their fates. Basically saying that the only way to, that there was going to be a lot of deaths, and that this is why they had to win the war. That was, these people's deaths were just an unfortunate cost to what they had to do to win the war. So again, I want to drive this home. If you say you couldn't make peace with Hitler because he was evil, and yes, he was evil, then you did nothing to stop his evil. Like, I guess they fought Hitler, but they had opportunities to take in Jews, to rescue Jews, to allow them a place of safe refuge, and they did nothing. And I think that's kind of hypocritical, because you can't say, well, like it would have been pointless for Churchill and others to try to negotiate with Hitler because of how evil he is. It's like, if you knew how evil he was, then you should have tried even harder to be like, yeah, you're offering to pay to get the Jews out. We'll pay to get the Jews out. Don't kill don't do it. They did nothing. It wasn't ignorance. It was indifference. And that's a historical reality we have to confront if we want to stop history from repeating itself. So the same powers who claimed the moral high ground, who said they had to go to war because Hitler was irredeemable, refused to act when it mattered the most. They just let it happen. And that's the contradiction we're wrestling with here. And we're not wrestling with this to condemn everyone, not to rewrite history in favor of the other side, but to confront history with open eyes and open hearts so we don't repeat those mistakes again. So it's not that Hitler was good. It's about saying that Churchill wasn't. Right? So it's about admitting that both sides were deeply compromised, and that the moral clarity we project onto that war is really just comforting illusion. It is post hoc. It's one that we use to justify our foreign policy today, as I've already talked about. Why I like to say it's not history, and these wars are often not good guys versus bad guys. It's just bad guys versus worse guys. But questioning that story gets you labeled as a revisionist or even worse. But we need to ask these questions. Because if this is how the West handled World War II and the Holocaust, if they knew what was happening and either refused to act or acted poorly, right, and show they had a faulty moral compass, showed that, it's easy for them to post hoc say that it was a moral war and crusade, when really we just see more of they were concerned about their power, their territories. It was all based on that, is what I would argue. So if we see that at play here, even in World War II, which is supposed to be the most moral war we ever fought, I guess there's that in the Civil War. What does that tell us about how they got here in the first place, right? Like, not just during the war, but before that. Like, how did we get here? So if we zoom out from that, like, what led to the rise of Hitler? Was the Treaty of Versailles just towards Germany? Were the German people's grievances all illegitimate? And was their despair entirely irrational? Now, to be fair, it is more within the acceptable, the allowable, the index card of allowable opinion, as Tom Woods says, to talk about the Treaty of Versailles and how that played a huge role in allowing Hitler to rise to power. But even then, I think, and we cover this, I remember covering this in high school, but I still don't think we give it enough daylight talking about this. And these are the questions that Daryl Cooper wants us to ask. And it's what Scott Horton raised in his conversation with him. And it's something I've even brought up back in episode 58, because the parallels to our time are too obvious to ignore. Think about it. A humiliated population, a nation crushed economically, cultural and moral confusion, institutional distrust, a people who feel voiceless and directionless, and who are looking for someone to blame and are looking for someone to save them. Does that ring any bells? Does that sound familiar at all? Because that's what Germany looked like in the 1920s and 30s, and if we're honest, that is not that much dissimilar from what we're seeing across much of the West today. So no, we're not drawing moral equivalencies. We're drawing warnings. For all the talk about, those who don't, learn from history are doomed to repeat it. It seems like people don't want to learn their history. Like I agree with that saying, but then when you get people like Daryl Cooper or Scott Horton or Dave Smith who are like, hey, let's actually dive into the history, and I think we're telling a story about the history that oversimplifies it in ways that we're going to miss things and then repeat those mistakes, Like, oh no, it's the opposite. Like these people, my camp, if I'm going to associate with them in that way, gets labeled as revisionists and that we're minimizing the Holocaust. I'm going to flip it around and say, no, you're the ones that are minimizing and diminishing the Holocaust because you're using the Holocaust, you're using the sentiment of never again to justify modern day Holocausts and to put us on the path towards tyrannical regimes like the Nazis, or at least something close to that, or similar to that, to happen again. Because when people feel abandoned, when they feel disenfranchised, when they feel lied to and betrayed by the media, by their elites, they get desperate. And desperate people don't always make noble choices. And that's how evil rises. Not from cartoon villains in back rooms, but from real people in pain, grabbing onto anything that seems like a solution, that seems to offer clarity amidst the chaos. And that's the lesson we need to learn. So I don't know. Does Daryl get 100% of everything right? I don't know who does, right? I'm sure if you listen to, he's got hundreds of hours of podcasts and writings to go through. And I'm sure you can nitpick some things. I've seen a couple things people say that he's gotten wrong or gotten slightly, maybe overemphasizing certain things. But, if we're picking at nits, like we're missing the point. And even when he's getting something wrong, I mean, he's, again, super well researched, and he's always trying to put you in the heads of the people he's talking about. Even though he's a critic, as I am, of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians and of Zionism, his series Fear and Loathing starts out by forcing us to understand Zionism and why the Jewish people were drawn to it. If you really want to understand how Daryl approaches this and why it matters, I challenge you. Go listen to the first 30 minutes of part 1 of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem. Seriously, just the first half hour. You'll notice the connection immediately. Here's the opening of this episode, the slow, deliberate immersion, the moral tension, and the question he forces you to confront, not just about Zionism, not just about Germany or the Arabs, but about every atrocity in history, about every group of people in history who have ever gone through something terrible. And he says, what would you do? That's the question that Daryl never stops asking. Not to excuse, not to glorify, but to understand. Because it's one thing to just give you the facts of history. It's another thing to put you in the place and the minds and the hearts of the people in that history so you can actually see and feel in your head, be like, I understand how this happened. It didn't just we're not just living in a world where things are out of control. No, that's a world of cause and effect. As I said last week, actions have consequences. And the more you put yourself in the minds and the hearts of the people, even people who find themselves falling prey to evil, despotic men who then bring out the worst in them, who bring out demonic forces that perpetuate some of the worst evils in history, I get real angry, just a little off script here. I really admire people like Jordan Peterson, but Jordan's kind of been on the side lately of criticizing the anti-interventionist, anti-war camp and those who are critical of Israel. But I learned this from Jordan Peterson, what Daryl Cooper's doing. Because Jordan Peterson has said many times that everyone wants to think that they're Oscar Schindler in the middle of the Holocaust, but that you would more than likely be rounding up your Jewish neighbors and reporting them to the SS. That's the truth of the total deprivation of sin in our heart, of human nature, that we're cowards and we lack moral strength and clarity when it comes to when we find ourselves in those situations. It's not even just that you'll do it out of fear. It's that you'll be convinced that it's the right thing to do. How does that happen? That's what Jordan Peterson has talked about in the past, and I wish he'd be consistent on that. And that's all Daryl's doing. That's what Scott's doing. And that's what I'm trying to do. Because until we can imagine what it would feel like to be desperate, abandoned, and betrayed, we can't, until we feel the gravity of those moments, we'll never truly comprehend the history and how those evil regimes rose. And, the same principle applies to even more than just history and foreign policy. This idea of like, what would you do? It's not just for Gaza or Germany or Zionism. You can even bring it closer to home. I brought up in the beginning the Killdozer incident, right? This Marvin Haymeyer, I think that's how you pronounce it, Haymeyer, the man behind the Killdozer incident. And he's not a Nazi, not a terror. Well, I guess he kind of was a domestic terrorist, you could say. But he like before this, he wasn't, right? He wasn't like a jihadist or something. But he was a small town welder in Colorado, a normal American citizen, someone who spent years trying to fight what he believed was corrupt local government behavior through every legal and peaceful means available. And when every door seemed shut, and even when every appeal felt rigged against him, he finally hit this point where he snapped. So he armored a bulldozer, a Komatsu, and went on a destructive rampage against the town's institutions that he believed had ruined his life. And no one died, although I do think he did shoot at a couple of the police officers and people who were trying to stop him. And I want to be clear, I'm not endorsing what he did, right? Because even though no one died, like he still, there was force initiated and threatened against innocent people, and that's not justified. But Marvin's story does serve as a reminder to what I'm talking about here. And like think about this: even in America, even under relatively peaceful conditions, people can be driven to radical and destructive actions by systemic injustice and corruption and despair. And when they feel trapped, when they believe there's no other way out, they lash out. And again, understanding why someone like Marvin snapped isn't about excusing it. It's about being able to recognize the warning signs before it happens again for individuals and for nations and for society. And, like with Marvin and Killdozer, there's this kind of folklore built around him, memes and slogans, and a lot of times even admiration in certain corners. And there's this expression. It says, sometimes reasonable men must do unreasonable things. Now, whether or not you believe that captures the full truth of Marvin's actions, it proves the deeper point that Daryl Cooper and I and others are trying to make, that we can all imagine it. We can all imagine being pushed to the edge. We can all understand at least a little bit what drives some people to desperate measures when faced with persistent injustice or tyranny. To the point where we'll even, idolize or make a folklore out of someone who, even if I'd say he went too far, but there's people who go like, I get it. Sometimes you get pushed to the edge, and people think that the ends justify the means. For Marvin, it was his livelihood, his years of labor, his dignity squeezed out by a corrupt alliance between politicians and big businesses until he believed he had nothing left to lose. So now let's go back to the story we started this episode with. The father in Gaza, holding his starving child, watching bombs fall, hearing the world call him a terrorist just because he lives in Gaza. Put yourself in his shoes. What would you do? Let's be clear about something. Gaza has been under Hamas's rule and Israeli, occupation for 20 years. I mean, really, the Israeli occupation for longer than that, but the Hamas rule for 20. And that's long enough that most of the population living there today was either born into it or raised under it. Even in 2005, when Hamas first entered the political process, as I said last week, they didn't win a majority, not even close. They didn't win a majority in any of the precincts. And so the story we often hear that Gaza is just Hamas, right? Palestinians are Hamas. It doesn't hold up. The reality is more complicated. And then we add, again, this is just indisputable, that Israel intentionally worked to empower Hamas, to divide and conquer and weaken the Palestinians, to keep Gaza isolated from the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority, to avoid having to pursue a two-state solution or some other solution to give the Palestinians their rights and their liberties. And yet, even after years of blockade and humiliation and starvation and occupation, not every Palestinian was radicalized into violence. And while there's many examples, none is greater to prove my point of this than in 2018, when the people of Gaza organized the Great March of Return, which wasn't a terror attack, wasn't a military intervention, it was a protest. Thousands of civilians, families, teenagers, kids, marched towards the fence separating Gaza from Israel, and they demanded two basic things: end the blockade of Gaza, allow Palestinian refugees the right to return to the homes they were driven from in 1948. And how did Israel respond? With snipers, with live ammunition, with tear gas and mass shootings. Over 200 Palestinians were killed, many shot in the legs, many left permanently disabled, just thousands more than the hundreds that were killed were wounded, and the world barely blinked. So when people say that Palestinians only understand violence, they hate Israel, it's a death cult that wants to destroy the Jewish people. No, that is not all the Palestinians, and many of them have tried protests. They've tried diplomacy. They've tried elections. Every peaceful door has been slammed shut. Every attempt at nonviolent resistance has been met with bullets and bombs and silence from the so-called civilized world. So what would you do? That's not a rhetorical question. It's the moral heart of this entire episode. If you have kids and you understand how tragic that is, you just put yourself in that position. Imagine that you're a father and you just had a bomb dropped on your house and you are the only one left, and you're sitting there looking around at the blown up bits of your family, and you tell me you can't understand how you could get radicalized into violence at that moment. The fact that some didn't is just a testimony to that. Even though we are sinful, even though we are totally depraved, that we aren't always as depraved as we could be. Again, what would you do? It's not a rhetorical question. If we can't ask that question, if we can't entertain the humanity of the people that we're bombing, then we're not serving the kingdom of God. We're serving the kingdoms of this world. And here's the deeper reality. Both sides of this story, the Jews and the Palestinians, have been through hell. The intro to Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem is about the anti-Semitism and the pogroms that the Jewish people suffered in Eastern and Western Europe before and after World War I in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Really for a long time before that. The Jewish people have been through so much hell. And the criticism that Daryl and I have for Zionism is essentially that, after a while, the Jewish people got tired of that and decided they're going to have a homeland and they're going to do it at any cost, even if it means displacing Arabs from Palestine. They said that explicitly. That's not revisionist history at all. That is fact. But listen, this isn't about picking one victim and one villain. It's about recognizing that trauma runs deep on both sides, that the fear, the pain, the desperation that drives people to terrorism or to resistance, that didn't spring out of nowhere. And Daryl Cooper, not Scott Horton and not Dave Smith and not me, we're not revisionists who are trying to make you hate Churchill and love Hitler. We're trying to do something much harder, something much more important. we're trying to see the humanity in every group of people, to force us to understand that the forces that drive nations, movements, and individuals towards decisions that from the outside look insane or monstrous, to understand that that could be us, to understand what those forces are, and to be able to be like that could be me. And also because if we believe Jesus's words, and we're going to obey them, right? We're going to follow them. That means loving our neighbor and our enemy. That's not optional. If we only see good guys and bad guys, we'll never understand history, and we'll never be fully capable of loving anyone outside of our own tribe. The Apostle Paul wrote in Ephesians 2 that Christ himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. And in Galatians 3, he reminds us that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Jesus came and he came to save us, right? And I said last week that I think it was last week, I don't know, in a recent episode, that salvation is on the individual basis, right? That when Jesus died to save you, he died to save you from your sins. And the gospel should always be at the core of what we're talking about when it comes to Jesus and what he did. But he didn't just come to save individuals and to restore what was lost. He also came to tear down the walls between tribes and races and nations. His parables, his teachings, his example, they shattered then and now the social norms of both his time and our time. He touched the untouchable. He dined with sinners. He healed Samaritans. He refused to play by the rules that said these people are clean and those people are dirty. He calls us to that same radical love, because the hard truth is that we were once enemies of God. We hated him. We rebelled against him. And yet, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. It is easy to love those who love us, but Jesus calls us to something far harder, to love those we are told to hate, even to love those who hate us, who have done evil to us, who have done evil to other people. And not to deny justice, not to excuse the sin, but by remembering that every human being bears the image of God, and that the only thing that separates us from them are the circumstances that we've lived through and the grace that God has shown us, the grace and the work of Jesus Christ. Every human being bears the image of God, even our enemies, even the ones we're told not to see. So here's the deeper reality. Both sides of this story, the Jews and the Palestinians, have been through hell. You don't have to pick a side. You don't have to diminish one to love the other or hate one to defend the other. You can love both. And that's what I hope that this episode spurs you to do. To see the humanity and to go out there and, remember the gospel message is for everyone. And if as a church, if we're called to spread the gospel to the nations, to tell people of the good news, let's stop dropping bombs on the people that we're supposed to be evangelizing. Can we do that? Well, listen, I'm anti-war. I'm a libertarian. Maybe that's pie in the sky thinking, right? To think we're going to have a free society. I think we could have a free society, but there's always going to be, those who do evil, murder, theft, injustice, assault. But man, could we just imagine that maybe we avoid the worsts? That we could just live in a world where we don't drop bombs on innocent civilians? And as I said last week, what do you do now? That's a good question to ask. What do you do now? What do you do with Hamas? What do you do with Israel? I tell you what you don't do. You do not set on a course that ensures that we're back here in 20 more years. we have to repent. We have to choose love. We have to choose peace. And we have to choose to live counterculturally as ambassadors for Christ's kingdom and not purveyors of propaganda for the kingdom of this world. Thanks for listening today. If this episode challenged you, good. It's supposed to. This episode took me a while to write out and to read, and it's one of those episodes that I don't know the right way to put a bow in it and end it. But again, I think the most important point is that if Christ died for us while we were his enemies, that has real ramifications and consequences for how we should view our enemies. So if you want to support the show, as always, please go to biblicalanarchypodcast.com, click the donate link, and you can sign up to be an LCI insider. If you want to support the show, you can also like this, subscribe if you haven't already, share it on social media. And that's all I have for you guys. Until next time, live at peace, live for Christ. Take care.
The Biblical Anarchy Podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.